Welcome everyone. Really nice to see you. Good afternoon. This is a Transform Justice webinar. I'm Fanula Ratcliffe, Research and Policy Lead. I'm here with my colleagues Penelope and Courtney, also from Transform Justice. This webinar is called Do You Know What You're Missing? Uncovering Opportunities for Diversion from Court. We believe at Transform Justice there is great potential to make better use of out-of-court resolutions, particularly for those cases which are currently going to the magistrate's court and ending in a court fine. The evidence shows there's better evidence around reducing reoffending for out-of-court resolutions versus all types of court sanctions. Where it exists, evidence around how victims feel about out-of-court resolutions is pretty good too. And obviously it helps with and is part of the solution to some of the crises facing the criminal justice system at the moment, particularly the court backlog, to some extent, the prison capacity crisis. So I know many of you who are here at this call are here because perhaps you agree with some of that sentiment. But if you're a police force or another organisation working in the criminal justice system, how might you practically go about identifying those cases which are heading for court, which might better be diverted? So that's the focus of this next hour. We've got some really excellent speakers who I'll introduce as we go along, or Penelope will when she comes in, followed by a Q&A at the end. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. So this is a webinar. Unless you're a speaker, I'm afraid currently you're muted and your camera's off just to keep us running smoothly and on track. But do use the Q&A function, which is the Q&A button at the top of your Teams page to ask any questions. When the time comes, we may try and unmute you so you can ask the questions yourself, technology allowing. You can also, if you go into that Q&A tab, you can see other people's questions and vote for them if you think they're really good and want them answered. So do feel free to do that as well. I know, depending on the version of Teams, or we're not sure why, but not everyone can always see the Q&A function. So feel free to ask questions in the chat, and Courtney and I will keep an eye on both. So if it's in the chat, don't worry, we won't miss it. Feel free to also use the chat to introduce yourselves and share reflections. I know some of you are using it at the moment to introduce yourself. That's great. Feel free to use it to chat and share links with each other. We're recording this webinar and we'll send round a link afterwards for anyone who's missed it or wants to have a look again. So as I said, we've got some great speakers lined up. It's going to be a jam-packed hour. Kicking us off is Jonathan Lay, CEO of Make Time Count, who's done some excellent data analysis estimating the scale of the opportunity to deal with more cases without going to court. So, Jonathan, you should be able to unmute and camera yourself. Let me know if you'd like me to share slides or if you're ready to, Jonathan.
Oh yes, I can't share. So if you could, that would be. That would be
I'll share, yeah, and you just tell me if you need to go on. Okay.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my name is Jonathan Lay. I'm the founder of a social enterprise called Make Time Count today. We're a technology company trying to transform the criminal justice system. I have another talk on how frustrating that is if you want the link to that one. But we won an Innovate grant. It was our second Innovate grant that we've won. So Innovate is a UK R&D program that dishes out about £25 million a quarter to innovative companies doing research. So ours was to look at the court backlog and how we could use technology to reduce it. So the first thing we did was we analysed a whole decade worth of court data. So 2010 to 2020, we looked at all sort of low-level non-motoring offences, and basically broke them all down, came to the conclusion that 75% of all cases that go to magistrates result in a fine or compensation of under £250. Even when you look at the Crown Court data, it's about 12%. So there's a huge volume of churn, for want of a better word, that's going to the magistrate's court that doesn't necessarily need to be there because the police, have the powers to issue similar sanctions. And if you think about the background to when we kicked off this Innovate grant, the court backlog had doubled over the last 2 or 3 years. I think we were up at almost 400,000 cases across magistrates and Crown Court, and sort of historic low levels of victim satisfaction. So we looked at the real, didn't need to think about AI, the very sort of simple factors that seem to push a case to that fine compensation rather than another sanction. Very simple. Was it the person's first, second, or third offence? Was it only one offence they committed? It wasn't a sort of multitude. And had they admitted guilt? So fairly simple kind of rules. Again, you didn't need to use sort of detailed analytics. It was very simple. If those three things were in place, the chances are they were going to get a relatively low sanction. So sending all of those cases to court is hugely time consuming for the police. So research from Durham Police says that it takes between 40 and 45 hours to take a case to court. So that's roughly about £2,600 for the police. And then there's the CPS cost, the magistrate cost, etc. And there's a quote recently from the Commissioner of the Met says that it takes 5 times as much work as it did 20 years ago to get a case to court. So we then looked at, well, based on the work we've done with police on out-of-court resolutions, how long does an out-of-court resolution actually take? And this is going right from first response all the way through to court. That's 40 to 45 hours. If you make that decision kind of as early as possible, using the work we've done with Kent, the Met, and other police forces, we could save roughly 20 hours per case. So we use what's called an eligibility screening tool, make that decision early, don't send it to court, do an out-of-court resolution. We could save about 20 hours per case. If we divert roughly 20% of all cases, so bearing in mind 75% all result in a very, very low sanction, taking 20% is a very, very low number, I would suggest. If you take 20% of those cases, don't send them to magistrates, send them to out-of-court resolutions instead, you save roughly £300 million across the police and CPS and the magistrates. So it's quite a large number. And obviously that translates to police officers back on the street, actually doing the work I would suggest the public wants them to do. So in terms of identification, we think it's very simple. It's those low-level offences, single offence for the user, or less than 3 offences. Is there only one sort of offence on the ticket, and have they admitted guilt? If you identify those cases, we think the out-of-court resolution is the right path to go. And if you slip down to the next slide, please, Anila. So our first Innovate grant we won was sponsored by the MPCC and included the Met Police, BTP, Leicestershire, Kent, and City, looking at how we build a technology platform that can actually manage the full end-to-end process for an out-of-court resolution. So from that upfront eligibility screening that I talked about, so should I give an out-of-court resolution? Should I send this person to court? Then understanding what this person needs. So did the person steal the Mars bar because they don't have a job and they're hungry, just because they think it's funny, or they want to sell that Mars bar and buy drugs? So you need to understand the kind of reason for why the person did what they did before you can then actually refer that person to a community of third parties that can support them. So we talk about creating a personal pit crew around each offender, or indeed victim. We do the same thing for the victim as well. So if you see that little diagram, we've got Johnny in the middle as the offender, and around him we might have the police officer that's looking after him. We might have a mental health advisor. We might have a sports club supporting them. We might have a peer mentor. We might even have a family member, all interacting via technology to make sure that that Johnny stays on the straight and narrow. So that's the sort of technology platform that we built and is currently in use in Kent Police and with TVP, and we're in a discussion with a number of other police forces. As soon as the government announces the new legislation requiring forces to do more out-of-court resolutions, we're looking to implement across a wide number of forces. Based on research from Kent, we save roughly about an hour and a half per case, doing it digitally versus doing it via paper. And that translates to about 180 officers not sitting doing paperwork for out-of-court resolutions, but actually doing it digitally and then back on the street helping people. We've actually compiled a white paper with Accenture where we looked at the full impact across society. So looking at cost savings for police, cost savings for the criminal justice system. And based on the reduced reoffending that research suggests out-of-court resolution can have, we believe there's $1 billion+ savings across the society in general. So that's something we've created, and again, I'm happy to share that with people if they're interested. As I said, we're live in Kent, so we're already doing this in Kent. But what we're seeing is, because the legislation is not yet enacted, many forces aren't making a decision on technology or indeed sort of processes. But we are expecting that legislation to come out imminently, in fact this month. So hopefully we'll have more success trying to push other forces down this route. Fionnuala, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Really interesting hearing about that work with your data analysis of all those many court cases. Next up, Professor Eddie Kane, Director of the Centre for Health and Justice at the University of Nottingham. Professor Kane's going to talk through a guide he's written for police on how to identify missed opportunities to use out-of-court resolutions. I've got your slides here ready, so I can keep moving on as long as we can see and hear you.
Yeah, can you see me? Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Cool. I'll move on to your first slide.
Thanks very much. Okay. Jonathan's outlined a very sort of impressive case around the economics of this and the sort of time saved and the effectiveness of it. Our research looks specifically at people with healthcare vulnerabilities and the opportunities that are being missed to give those individuals out-of-court disposals. But frankly, most of what we found in our research you could apply outside of health vulnerabilities. It's just that was the specific focus of our research. So why should you identify missed opportunities for out-of-court resolutions? I think Jonathan's already outlined a lot of this, but I mean, they can undo reduce long-term reoffending rates. And it always sort of strikes me as not being somebody involved directly in policing why you would carry on doing something.
Eddie, sorry to interrupt you. We can't actually see you at the moment. Don't know if you can turn your camera on and off again, off and on again. There we go. Yeah, thank you.
Don't know why, but there you go. Sorry. So it's gone off again, so I'm not really sure what's going on with that. Anyway, I'll carry on. I'll keep clicking it on and off.
Yeah.
So because they can reduce long-term reoffending rates, and demonstrably, giving people low-level fines or very short sentences isn't an effective way of actually preventing reoffending, or indeed offering an opportunity for individuals to turn their lives around. Our research absolutely clearly demonstrates that opportunities for out-of-court disposals are being missed. It's unequivocal, longitudinal research, so it's not a snapshot of a few days. This is with a number of forces over a long period of time. And I suppose one of the other major sort of issues is that frontline officers, lack the tools and training to consider out-of-court resolutions quite often. And many frontline officers are actually making these decisions in the first place, or at least the recommendation to make an out-of-court resolution decision, are fairly inexperienced, and they're often not supported by any sort of structured central team or support that might help them move through and make the decisions in an effective way. So we identified a couple of methods for identifying missed opportunities, two that we want to sort of highlight here. And I'm not going to go into depth about them. The guide's available online, and it has much more detail in it than I'm going to go through today. But just sort of in headline terms, the simple way is a retrospective review. So basically it's to review the resolutions that have been given and not given for a fixed period of time. It allows you to estimate the size of the problem and identify why you missed the opportunities that could have occurred. How do you do it? Very simple, really. Use a sample of the last year of cases, identify the resolution types for offences that qualify for an out-of-court resolution, and you know what they are, usually based on a gravity matrix, but I'm not going to go into detail. Most of you are working in the CJS and policing will know what they are, but it's detailed in the guide. Break down them by the suspect characteristics, things like age, gender, ethnicity, and offending history, and randomly sample about 100 cases to investigate in more depth. Now, this is not as challenging as it might sound. All police departments have the capacity to do this in their performance directorates. And I know they might be doing a lot of other things, but given the financial and the economic numbers that Jonathan's highlighted, never mind the sort of ethical issues involved in it, it doesn't make a lot of sense not to be doing this sort of thing, to see where you could make these decisions more effectively and where you could both save money and find better outcomes for individuals as well as for society more generally. So it's not a difficult thing to do, this retrospective method. If you just want to move on to the next one, Fiona, please. So the ongoing monitoring method does take up more time. It involves real-time review of decisions soon after they're made. Why do that? It helps shape the decision-making process. It gives officers some rapid feedback on how they can improve what they're doing, and how to do this and how it's being done is detailed much in the guide. And just to say, this is not fantasy stuff. There are police forces who are doing this now, and we could put you in touch with people who are actually doing this now. So it is perfectly possible to do it within the resources that are available. And those forces have seen a major impact on the numbers of people who have been charged to court or NFA'd inappropriately. So I think it's perfectly feasible to do, and there are examples of it being done. So next one, please, Fiona. So estimating the impact of missed opportunities. If you want to demonstrate, to your colleagues in the senior command team, or you want to demonstrate to the OPCC or whoever, or the public in your area, it's really quite a simple way of doing it. There are more than two ways of doing it. There are more, but these two are the sort of most obvious ones. The simple one is to follow up over a period of time each person given an out-of-court disposal resolution, and compare their rearrest and reoffending rates to those of the missed opportunities that are identified in the way I just described earlier. So you're actually looking at just what happens to people who do or don't get an out-of-court resolution in terms of their coming back to your attention, or coming back to the attention of the police and the criminal justice system. There are plenty of data sources for this that are really easily accessible: crime, custody, voluntary attendance systems, obviously PNC for within area rearrests and the out-of-court resolutions. So there are plenty of data sources. Some forces that we worked with in the particular case studies that we did within the research, and bear in mind our research covered every police force in England and Wales, but we did work with some forces much more intensively. And within those, some have got very good systems that already integrate these sorts of snips of information. Others have to do it more manually, but it is doable. It's not as demanding as it may sound. And certainly, again, talking to folk in your performance departments should give you a way through this. In the guide, we do describe a much more rigorous and a sort of a quasi-experimental approach to doing this, which does take more time. But again, you're likely to have analysts who would be capable of doing this, and certainly probably interested in doing this. But the simple approach will provide you with what you need. Okay, and last slide, I think, Fiona. Yeah, that's the last slide. I'll leave it at that then. I'm happy to take any questions, and please do look at the guide because there's much more detail in the guide.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Please do add questions through the Q&A or the chat for Eddie or Jonathan, and we'll come to them at the end. We'll also send a link to the missed opportunities guide that Eddie was talking about in the follow-up email afterwards, so people can look at that in more detail. Fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to Penelope now, Director of Transformed Justice, who's going to have a couple of conversations with people who are putting some of what Eddie has been talking about into practice. Over to you, Penelope. You're on mute, Penelope.
Classic. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm going to be talking to Nick Finnis, who is temporary superintendent at Kent Police, but was previously head of criminal justice. And he's going to talk about his experience there trying to analyse cases that went to court, which perhaps didn't need to. So Nick, in Kent, you introduced a central case review team which looked at cases due to go to court and to look at what had been charged and to ask if an out-of-court resolution could be used instead. Can you just tell us a bit more about how that worked and why you decided to add that extra layer? Because obviously normally it's just a decision, often in custody, to ask for charge or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we first started this work, I suppose, looking at it like most forces, we'd already created a central case review function, really just to improve our case file quality. And then what we saw was this real, I suppose, missed opportunity, using that phrase. But actually, we had a small specialist team of officers reviewing cases, not just cases that had already been charged, but cases that were being sent to CPS. And we had this gatekeeping team who were initially looking at, was the case file going to get through CPS triage? Was it going to get through the DG6 assessment that CPS would conduct on it? Would it result in a guilty plea at first hearing? All those kind of questions that forces probably on the call are struggling with, or have struggled with, over the last 24 months. But what we saw was this opportunity to bolt on an extra question, which was either, if this case has it been charged, is it a guilty anticipated plea case? Have we missed an opportunity? And if we have, what can we do about it? Either can we capture some learning, feed that back, or do we still have time to make an intervention? And some of those cases, we would take out of the system. We would use that small window of opportunity before the first hearing. So rather than just reviewing the file and saying, yeah, all the evidence is there, it meets the required standards, let's let it run to court. Let's try and take it out of the system. Let's get in touch with the defendant, offer them that opportunity to accept an out-of-court resolution instead, and divert that case to our central out-of-court resolution team. It's not always possible. Sometimes you can't track the defendant down. Sometimes legal reps can't even get hold of them, but we took the opportunity where we could. I think the other opportunity we had was our pre-charge decisions. So we made sure all our pre-charge reviews come through that same central team. So when officers are sending their case to CPS to say, we want to send this to CPS for a decision, actually, it is a guilty plea, but we're sending it because it's I don't know, there's a reason it's an either way offence, and there's some sort of category it means it's got to go to CPS. I can't think off the top of my head, but we would look at those opportunities and go, can we go back to that defendant? In fact, the best opportunity probably was no comments. They went no comment, but it's clearly evidenced on CCTV. Well, can we go back to them and say, we're about to send this to CPS. You are going to get charged because the evidence is there. Are you sure there's nothing you want to consider? Here's another an opportunity to be re-interviewed. Now, there's some risks to that. There's some delay around delaying justice, delaying charges, but it was the right thing to do for defendants. And ultimately, if it meant the victim got maybe a better outcome through that out-of-court resolution process, then we were happy with that. So it was really just using the team we already had. It wasn't creating something new. It was just saying, well, let's add that extra question and look at that opportunity to review those cases with a different point of view.
So what kind of cases? You talked about either way, but can you give any more examples of the kind of cases that the review team was looking out for?
So interestingly, I think one of the ones that stood out straight away was assault on emergency workers. We had a real culture of trying to charge that almost regardless of history, antecedents. And often those cases would be no comment. And for some reason, it might be that we'd had to anticipate a not guilty plea and we were sending it to CPS, or we charged it as a guilty anticipated plea on a no comment. And they were really quite simple cases to be able to go back to legal reps and say, look, for some reason you've advised no comment. Clearly this is going to get charged because it's fully made out on body-worn video. Is there any reason your client doesn't want to accept an out-of-court resolution? And it was particularly easy when we had those legal reps involved, because it kind of created a safety barrier between us engaging and looking like we're coercing admissions, which was a big concern for officers. Around where they had their opportunity, they've been interviewed, but it's trying to just be a bit innovative and say, well, actually, let's go back and make that final offer. And that links to a bit of work we did with the Law Society in Kent. So Kent Law Society have been really supportive of the work we've done. They've consulted with us on a notice that we developed, a one-page notice, almost born out of the old taken into consideration notice we used to give to every person that got arrested for certain crimes. And actually, if it's a first-time person in custody or someone that just appears to be eligible, we've now got a one-page notice we give them in custody to say, there's every possibility you could leave here with an out-of-court resolution. This is what that means. this is what actually, let's make this simple and actually explain it to you in a way you might understand, and remind you that you can speak to a solicitor and talk it through with them. But if you fully admit the crime, then you could be eligible for one of these outcomes. So we've looked at how we can really try and help people coming through custody understand that as well. So I think assault emergency workers was a big one, damage to police property, and then I suppose it has been shopliftings, criminal damages that have been police charged, those sort of opportunities to divert those out. Just those low level cases that Jonathan talked about, really.
And you're generally presumably diverting them, offering a conditional caution or simple caution?
Or community resolution, yeah, absolutely. So, even some of these cases, and we've looked at some of these, we've done almost what Eddie was talking about, a bit of a retrospective look at some of our cases. We know that certainly, I think it was July this year, 7% of the cases we put into the magistrates court resulted in a conditional discharge, which is a ridiculous number of cases. So when you deep dive into that, and we have done that, we've seen some of them I'd probably disagree, and I think maybe they did need to be charged, and the outcome's the outcome. That's not for me to be concerned about. But there were opportunities in there we missed, and we took some of those cases and we shared those with the senior leaders across Kent Police, so all the chief inspectors and above, up to chief constable. We literally summarised them and said, look, we had a case where very minor criminal damage. We've arrested the person. They actually got kept in custody for 24 hours. He'd already admitted the whole thing at the scene of the crime. So why it took 24 hours to get to it, and we still charged him. And actually, we had the opportunity to divert that to a community resolution. We should have done from the minute we met him. We shouldn't have even taken him to custody. And we've looked at some of those lessons learned and missed opportunities, really from the top down, to start saying how can we fix that.
And so this kind of system where even after thinking about charge, you're going back to the defence and saying, what about an out of court resolution? That's working well as well, is it, with the defence community? Yeah,
absolutely. Generally there's an appetite. There's normally a reason. We try to unpick why, and obviously it's difficult to get into too much detail with the defence community because they don't want to break confidentiality, quite rightly. But sometimes they will be quite honest and say, well, look, when the officer came down and gave us pre-interview disclosure, pre-interview briefing, they made a comment about it being a repeat offender, and we assumed it wasn't going to be a case that was eligible. So quite often it's that pre-interview briefing that makes all the difference, what's been said. And we're looking at some point in the near future to do a bit of work around that with our investigators to try and rectify it. But yeah, there's a real appetite from the defence community generally to try and to take that opportunity and stop these cases going to court. And we've also got it from CPS. So our central out of court resolution team, we did put a hotline in place so that any prosecutor in any court in Kent has got a dedicated number. They can pick up the phone and say, look, there's a case in my list today. I've had a look at it. The defence rep here is offering a full admission and willing to send this back if you'll offer a caution. But rather than adjourning it and sending it back and us reviewing it, they pick up the phone, we have that discussion whilst they're in the list ready to be heard at court, so that they can present it to the court and say, well, actually, I've already spoken to the police and they're willing to issue a caution next week, and they can send that case back. Yes, adjourn it, but it gives us that opportunity. It doesn't waste a hearing. If we then decide it's not eligible, we can have that conversation in court on the day, and that's going really well as well.
So can you quantify the impact of all these changes?
That's the bit that's really difficult for us because we've certainly seen, we were averaging as a force, if I go back 18 months, 2 years, we were averaging about 20 conditional cautions a month. We're now averaging just over 100. I'd like to say that the majority of those were charges that have now moved into the out of court space. The difficulty I think we've got is, our solve rate generally is going up. We are charging more and solving more crime. So it's difficult to say what we're moving out and moving and just generally solving through other tactics. So there's a bit of crossover, but it's really difficult to quantify. But the other bit of work we're doing, again, linking to what Jonathan was talking about and the make time count work, is there's a function in that we call it I decide, and it's a simple tool within the app that lets a supervisor, a decision maker, go through the case they're dealing with. So if they're at the point of saying, well, should I charge, should I offer an out of court, they can run it through this consistent tool to go, well, actually, based on all the circumstances, this is eligible for an out of court. And it gives them that extra level of
confidence.
Confidence, yeah, absolutely, and objectivity. So we're trying to remove that potential bias of, that may or may not be there in their mind of just go to charge. Well, actually, if they run it through that tool, they come up with that consistent outcome, and they can refer back to that. They can print it, they can upload it to the file and say, that's why I made that decision. So we're trying to empower people to have that and give them the tools they need to make the right decision from the outset. So we can then track it that way, rather than trying to measure what we've already put in the system and taking it back out, because that's really inefficient, and we know that.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Nick. Stick with us. People, please put questions in the Q&A function for any of our speakers, because we're going to have a bit of time at the end. I'm going to move on now to Anthony Hill, who works, I think, head of policy and strategy for the Crown Prosecution Service. And Anthony's going to talk to us about work that the Crown Prosecution Service have particularly done about trying to increase the diversion of under 18-year-olds, children, from the youth court. So, Anthony, at the CPS, you're developing a protocol for how prosecutors deal with children who don't admit to the offence at the police station, but then plead guilty at the youth court. First of all, have you got ideas on why a child might do this? Because it doesn't make much sense.
Hi, Penelope. Thank you for having me. I can draw on my sort of background as a defence barrister. I think so. I've sort of seen this both sides of it. But we can see there are many reasons why a child might make no comment or deny an offence when in fact they were culpable for it. Their confidence or distrust in the system, I think, is a major part of it. And we know from work like David Lammy's review that that's something that particularly affects Black and minority ethnic children, that they're far less likely to make a confession at the police station stage. There may be an issue about the nature and quality of the legal advice at the police station. It may well be the absolute right call from a defence rep to suggest a no comment, or indeed if a denial's being put forward to suggest that's put on record. But I think from what we've heard already, there may be issues around how the sort of police and the defence rep work together to identify and get to a position where an out of court disposal or resolution is made. And it may well be, particularly in the case of a child, that they sort of understand the process less. That police interview is really usually the sort of first and only opportunity for the child to put their version of events forward at the police station stage. It's obviously quite a big step to admit a crime, but there may be sort of less understanding about how far that can limit the available disposals, because in particular a formal statutory youth caution or a conditional caution, there must be an admission, and there must be a formal admission for that to be for that disposal to be administered. So if there's not a confession at a police station stage, that limits the available options for diversion.
So what are the challenges at the moment when a child goes no comment in the police station but later pleads guilty?
So we see this as an issue of fairness. I think we all recognise that, especially in the case of a child, diversion should be a consideration. I think everybody across the system wants to avoid criminalising children, and we know from all sorts of work that's been done how important it can be to turn children away from crime, and going before a youth court is often not the right approach for first offending and for lower level offending. So I think the difficulty can be, particularly for something that's just a little bit more serious, something that really that doesn't justify just taking no further action or a community resolution, but would justify youth caution or a conditional caution. I think that's where, in the lack of an admission, means that the child is then finding themselves put into the system. Whereas had they made admissions at the police station, that wouldn't have been the outcome. And so we see it as, bearing in mind the only difference between a child who confesses and gets a caution and a child who makes no comment and ends up in the police station. There's sort of no difference. There's no difference in the nature of the offence. There's no difference in the circumstances of the child. We were sort of keen to more formalise a chance to have a look at that child's case again, and so, once that sort of juggernaut of a court process has started, it's always been the case that a prosecutor can review the public interest in prosecuting at any time. And we often did, on an ad hoc basis, see cases that didn't feel appropriate for prosecution, where the defence will come to the prosecutor at court and say, look, my client admits this, but surely they should have got a caution or should be eligible for a conditional caution. And the challenge we've often got there is that there's quite an administrative process to do that. You can't just administer a caution.
To undo the charge, as it were.
Yeah. And we're up against a sort of efficiency drive in the courts, speedy summary justice and those sorts of initiatives, where courts have tried to absolutely wipe out unnecessary adjournments, reduce the number of court hearings in cases. So it could often be a bit of a lottery for a prosecutor who turns to the youth court and says, look, I want an adjournment in this case. I don't want to go forward. I want you to sort of put it back a few weeks so we can see if we can resolve this by way of a caution or conditional caution. Now, the difficulty there is there's often quite a lot of pressure to say, well, no, the child has sort of had their chance. They should have admitted at the time. We're going to take the plea, and that puts a child in a very difficult position because they did commit the crime. They're prepared to do so, but by pleading guilty, they're then getting a conviction rather than a caution, and you get sort of perverse outcomes sometimes. The child will then be pleading not guilty, and then you're adjourning off to a trial and trying to deal with diversion alongside that, which you can imagine the risks of that going wrong or not working out in many individual cases, and the inefficiency that results. The minute you're going off for a trial, witnesses need to be warned, court time put aside for the trial, you start having to prepare the case papers and disclosure in a more detailed way. So where we came to on this was to try and deal with this inconsistency between what one bench of magistrates or a district judge might feel is appropriate in one area or on one day, we were not seeing in other areas and on other days. So we've sort of been working across the system, talking to partners in policing, in the courts, in the judiciary, and with the support of everybody, used a working group that Mrs. Justice May chairs to decide on a process whereby it will be written into the court bench book that in a scenario like this, for a child, an adjournment will be necessary before taking a plea to allow consideration of an out-of-court disposal. So there's going to be, I think that's not been issued yet, but it's sort of agreed. But so there'll be a bit more backup for a prosecutor who says, sorry, I know this is the first hearing where a plea is supposed to be taken, but I want this case to be delayed for a few weeks because I think we can properly divert it. So when a prosecutor asks for that, there'll be a bench book support to say this is a perfectly proper thing that the magistrate or the district judge should allow. And then we'll have our own in-house protocol for prosecutors to for clarity as to how this works between us and the police to then deal with the diversion.
That sounds great, Anthony, and something which should be replicated for adults, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And I will hand back to Fionnuala at this point because we have some questions.
Great, thanks. And Courtney, I think you're just going to spotlight all of our speakers so that they're all in the firing line, as it were. We've had some great questions. As we go along, we're going to try and unmute people so that you can ask them yourselves if possible, but I'll just kick off with a very short one from Anya for Jonathan. Anya wants to know your source, Jonathan. You mentioned that legislation will likely come into force later this month. Where is this information from? Anything you can say about that before we get into the other questions?
I shouldn't disclose my sources. No, it was the department that's responsible for it, the Home Office, presented at the Birmingham conference on out-of-court resolutions, where all the police forces were invited, and that was the message that he gave. I mean, it was a fairly open meeting, including suppliers and other people, so it obviously wasn't that confidential because he mentioned it in front of a lot of people. So that they would say that was the target. Okay. It wasn't an announcement; it was the target, and I've been told it's been put in front of ministers and other people. So that's my source. It is the Outer Court Resolution Conference in Birmingham.
Thanks, Jonathan. I was there too. Anya, I wondered if you ask your other question for Nick. Hopefully Courtney has allowed you to unmute and you can do so and ask that. Perhaps not. In which case I'll ask it. Sorry, Anya. Nick, what's been your experience of this change for those charged with drugs offences or in drugs-related offending like acquisitive crime? This change, sorry, that you've made at Kent Police.
I think we have seen some cases, and I'm just sort of racking my brain for some examples, but we have seen some cases where first-time entrants to the system have come in and we've charged, and I see some strange decisions actually being made around, drugs are all sorts of write-ups by sergeants about drugs are a massive issue for the community. Therefore, despite this person being eligible, I'm going to charge them. They're easy ones for us to go back and challenge and offer those out of course. Generally, people are quite receptive. We did do a review of about 110 cautions that we'd issued, conditional cautions we'd issued in the last year, and only 1% of those issued a conditional caution had come back to our attention. So I can't break that down by crime type, but the success rate was really positive, and the uptake has been really receptive. I've not seen any difference from substance misuse or acquisitive crime from my perspective. I think, if anything, we've seen some real positive opportunities. Certainly, I remember a case of an individual caught with just some drugs outside a nightclub, fairly routine for us in policing, and suddenly found himself charged. But we were able to divert that case out and give him a conditional caution, and it was much better actually. He disclosed a lot of other issues that were going on financially, and personal relationships that we were then able to offer referrals around, and absolutely wrapped support around that. I'm no doubt he wouldn't have gotten in the first hearing, in a very fast first hearing at the Magistrates' Court.
Nick, we've had a question from Bawali. Forgive me if I pronounced that incorrectly. Bawali, you should be able to unmute and ask yourself from Action for Race Equality. If this doesn't work.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to find out more about if anyone had any thoughts now, and I guess looking into the future, if this is a viable way to actually address the racial disproportionality that we see in the criminal justice system, especially in police and court making decisions.
Thanks, Bawali. Anthony, maybe we come to you for that, since I know CPS has been doing some work on this.
Sorry, I just missed the last part of the question. My line went out.
It was whether
about
out-of-court resolutions. Oh, go ahead, Bawali.
Sorry, it was just about whether the out-of-court resolutions are a sustainable way of actually addressing racial disproportionality. I guess looking at the present time now and any cases that you've worked on, and then looking into the future.
Yeah, I think out-of-court resolutions have got a really important role to play in addressing race proportionality. You know, we know from a number of studies that there are disproportionate outcomes for Black and minority ethnic defendants across the system. And while each case has to be sort of dealt with on its own merits, it's clear that there are systemic hurdles, if I can put it that way, that sort of trip our sort of cases up and do lead to some of these unequal outcomes. So I think by looking at all of our processes and practices, I mean, what we've just been talking about, the fact that Black adults and boys, men and women, will all are less likely to make admissions to an offence, and indeed less likely to plead guilty to cases, means that they are not eligible or less eligible than white people. If you look at the data, less eligible for the sort of statutory cautions and conditional cautions, but also you see inequalities, for example, less likely to plead guilty, so then less likely to get a discount from sentencing, and then you see that the sentencing outcomes are unequal when you look at the data for defendants based on their ethnicity. So I think there's definitely room there to address some of that through either greater use of out-of-court disposals or challenging ourselves as to how that they're structured at the moment. And to the extent that sort of CPS has a role to play there, we're sort of very, very keen to look at that, and we're going to be publishing some research that we've been doing on disproportionality and some actions that we're going to take on disproportionality at the end of this month.
Thanks, Anthony. Jonathan, can I come in there?
Yeah, it's actually one of the key criteria that we were asked to address when we started working with the police forces. And I mentioned the eligibility screening tool. So this is a sort of a decision tree, a bunch of questions. I mean, Nick mentioned I decide, that every officer has to ask the same questions. So whether I've got Mary, Mike or Mohammed in front of me, I'm confident that the decision that came out of the other end of the tool went through exactly the same process. So I think in terms of addressing disproportionality, making sure that there's consistent decision making, and also transparency of decision making as well. So if the decision comes out as X and the officer changes that decision, visibility on that as well, and visibility on all the questions through the process. So we now not only know the decision was correct or the same, we know every single decision point and every single answer to every single question that the officer went through in order to come to that decision. And I think offering that level of transparency can be transformational in terms of that particular issue.
Thanks, Jonathan. James Reed, I'm going to come to you for your question, which I think Eddie might be able to have a go at. You should be able to unmute, James.
Yeah, I have, thanks. I mean, listening obviously to the savings, they're pretty compelling. So just a bit confused as to why out-of-court disposals are not more widely used. So what are maybe some of the kind of key obstacles which are preventing their usage? It seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, well, I think we feel very much the same, actually, when we were doing the research. It did seem fairly obvious. I think there are a number of reasons. I think, to be honest, quite a few officers are at the front line of actually dealing with cases on the street, may not be that aware of out-of-court resolutions as an option that's open to them, or they'll be aware of them, but not necessarily aware of what's available in the area in which they're operating, geographically or so. There's also people who are perhaps a little inexperienced and maybe not confident in going back to the sergeant, for example, and saying, I think this is the way that we should dispose of this case. I think forces that don't have a sort of a central team, as Nick's described, and there are other forces who do that as well, and they always seem, from the research that we did, they always seem to perform better in terms of the numbers of appropriate out-of-court resolutions versus charging to court or inappropriate NFAs. I think those are sort of some of the main ones. I think the lack of the actual resource, where you're involved in a conditional caution, for example, somebody has to do something as a consequence of getting the caution as part of the terms of the caution, just having things available for them to do, to connect them to, whether support service or mental health, whatever it is. So I think all of those things play around it. I think one of the other ones is that we came across, which is maybe sinister is probably the wrong word, but slightly more cynical view that some people just don't deserve to get out of court disposals. The community that they come from, the family that they come from, the area that they come from, all of those things were all and they're in the main report that we did for the MOJ. They were all cited within the police forces that we spoke to, and I think they probably a bigger, if more difficult, role to actually pin down than some of the other things that are often put forward as reasons why out-of-court resolutions aren't used. I think, Nick, you might have a sort of a comment on that. You may agree or disagree.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, and I think there's a systemic culture issue in policing that the charge is seen as kind of this the best outcome generally. I think some of that comes down to, if you charge someone, the outcome really is then in someone else's hands, whether that's CPS or the court, and that's often I think an easier, and I'm maybe being unfair to some cases, but I think for some officers that's easier to explain to a victim or someone who's been affected by that crime than saying, we've decided that an out-of-court resolution and we've decided these conditions, rather than, which then if they don't comply with, sometimes are enforceable, sometimes might not be. And I think it creates this idea that actually they've got to make a decision and be accountable to it. Whereas if I'm honest, I think pushing it into the court system sometimes is easier, because you can say, well, sorry, they only got a fine, but that's the court decision. I don't think the police complaints system makes that better. I think it creates a lot of concern for officers where if the victim complains, I've now got to be investigated. That's a long process. I think all of that works against the doing the right thing of actually what's the right outcome for the offender, the victim, and the community. So I just feel like there's a lot of barriers in place for officers when actually the easy route is just charge, put it in the system, move on.
Thanks, Nick. So we've got a few questions for Anthony Clare from Centre for Justice Innovation. I wonder if we can allow you to unmute and allow you to come in. Just one moment. You should be able to ask your question by unmuting, Anne Claire.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hiya. Yeah, thanks, Anthony. The sound of that protocol sounds absolutely great. I think it's what we've needed for a long time to get that consistency for children who appear in a court and then make their admissions. I just wondered, is it out? Is it sort of shareable? And also, because we know guidance is all well and good, but to get people to actually use guidance and implement it is there any work that the CPS are doing to encourage the courts to use it and the CPS to use it? Are you going to be monitoring its use? That's kind of question.
Yeah, so I think we're looking at about January 2025, so sort of January next year for launching it. As I say, that's when we believe the new version of the Youth Court Bench book is going to be published, and we'll want to issue a protocol alongside that in tandem. And then I think, as you say, an awareness raising piece, I think, for everybody in relation to it will be important. Defence community, prosecutors, police, and yachts, as well. As well as the magistrate. So it's sort of on the prosecutor to really assist the court and point to the change and point to the protocol to sort of support that coming through. So we think it should be obviously a prosecutor-led process, because ultimately it's our decision whether a case proceeds or not in the public interest. But we'll certainly, I think, probably look at a number of intervals through the year, really, for awareness raising. So you say it's a lot of people that need to be made aware of it, and just sending an email or a sort of popping something on the website isn't enough. So we'll be looking at lots of different ways to bring it to people's attention through all the different sort of media we use and the levers we've got for that.
Thanks, Anthony. We're coming up against time here, so I'm just going to smush a couple of questions together for Nick, because we've had lots of questions for you, Nick. One was about from Nicola, about women referred to the service that she works for as part of a conditional caution, being asked to attend and sometimes pay for courses like anger management, which can cause confusion and is a duplication of the work they do as part of their offer. If you refer onto these services, are you expecting all of that work to be completed with that service? Question makes sense?
I think so. So, yeah, we try to minimise the conditions we issue in Kent, certainly. I can only speak sort of from Kent's point of view, but we certainly take some of the research that's been done by Transform Justice and others to say actually less is more. If you overwhelm people with too many conditions, you make too many referrals, actually you probably set them up to fail. You're probably not adding much value to that diversionary outcome. So we do as minimal as possible. We don't support paid for courses. We don't expect offenders to pay for courses that we refer them to through conditional cautions in Kent, but we tend to try and work with our with the agencies we refer to make sure we're not crossing over or duplicating work.
Thanks, Nick. We better stop there. I'm sorry for any questions we didn't get to, but we want to finish on time. Thank you to our speakers for your excellent contributions. Great for you to be here today, and to all attendees. Just to mention Transform Justice, we have an offer for police forces who want to work with us. We are doing some free research with victims whose cases have ended in out-of-court resolutions. We're already working with 7 or 8 forces. And if you want to get involved to find out what victims in your area think about these options, let us know. We're really keen to find out more about that. We've also got our next webinar on 5th of December on using out-of-court resolutions for higher harm cases. There was a question about that in the chat I'm afraid we didn't get to, but tune in on the 5th of December. We'll send a sign-up link out in the follow-up email. Thank you, everyone, and hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday afternoon. Goodbye.